Hello, everyone. Today, I would like to talk with you about a book titled Reason and Rationality, written by Jon Elster. Jon Elster is a Norwegian social scientist and philosopher of social science, he has done a lot of work on political theory and methodology in social science. He has a very important book that went through 3 editions. The most recent one, 2015, was titled Explaining Social Behavior. It is an extremely useful work. One of the important things in that book, one of the things that he does in explaining social behavior, is that he distinguishes between mechanisms and prediction. We might be able to predict a group's behavior without really knowing why, without knowing the mechanisms. And we might be able to identify mechanisms without being able to predict what a particular person or a group of people do in a situation. So he's an important thinker. How I came across his work was not during my formal education, but while I was reading Nassim Nicholas Taleb's book, Black Swan. If you are familiar with Taleb's work, you know that he's extremely critical of academics, especially social scientists and even more especially economists. He doesn't have a lot of good things to say about them. But he pointed out how he is an exception to his rule. So I took a note and I thought, okay, I'd like to learn more about Elster. This is one of the books that I have read by him. It is quite short, so you might start, if you are interested in Elster, you might start here. This is with this short book, and then you can, if you like this one, his style, then you can go to other works like Sour Grapes, Solomonic Judgments, and the one that I mentioned previously, Explaining Social Behavior. So let's talk about reason and rationality. This book is translated by Stephen Randall and published in 2009 by Princeton University Press. The book is very short, but it is also very densely written. It's a very densely written exposition of these ideas and related ideas, reason and rationality. I have read this book so far 3 times, and I think it's very likely that I will read it again. Why? One of the reasons is for the aesthetic experience of reading Elster's style, the richness of his style. And just to pick one reason why I admire him, his thinking, setting aside for a moment his writing style, which we will get to in a bit. One of the things I admire about his style of thinking is that he shows how you can have a model, you can work with a model and be critical of it and be mindful of its shortcomings of a model. In this case, the model I'm referring to in the case of this book, the model is a model of human agency, human decision making, and it is the rational choice model, which comes with a lot of questionable assumptions about human nature. But he shows how you can actually use that as a reference point. You want to go to a particular point and discuss something, and you start with rational choice, and then you take further steps to get to where you want to get. But it really helps to have that reference point, even though it is not perfect. It has a lot of weaknesses, but you pick that rational choice as your starting point or as a point in your discussion, and then you use it to talk about the relationship between desires, beliefs, the justification for beliefs, and then action. So that's something I really like. The alternative is that you just criticize a model and then leave it aside and do your own thing. That's not the only possible option when we have problems with models and metaphors. Elster has a very strong, impressive background in the humanities or the classics, as well as contemporary approaches and trends in social science. So that's another thing that makes him a very enjoyable person to read. So the book, let's go from the beginning. The book begins with possible oppositions between reason and other things. So one way to introduce something is to say it is not the other thing. So by contrast, definition by contradistinction. So he says that it's possible to oppose reason, to introduce reason as opposed to passions or emotions. This, for example, he brings in the example of Seneca, how Seneca talks about anger, his treatment of anger. That's one way to introduce passions as opposed to reason. But that's not the only way to have opposites, reason opposed to something else. Another thing that is opposed to reason is self-interest. So self-interest, very calculated self-interest, very rational self-interest, can also be opposed to reason, which is to say that the idea of reason in general is connected to the common good. It is not related to what is good for me. It is related to the common good. We'll unpack that with a passage from the book. So reason and rationality, when we use them as criteria, there's a difference when we use reason as a criteria for evaluating somebody's behavior and when we are using rationality to evaluate the same behavior. So the difference is that it is the difference between making sense of a behavior in terms of how rational it is, in the sense in which it is rational. Like I can say, John turned on the TV because he was bored. That's a way of making sense. That he had reason for doing something that he did, and he believed that by pressing the button, the TV would turn on. So that's evaluating something in terms of its rationality, but we can also evaluate an action in terms of whether it meets the standards of reason, the normative standards of reason. So what is reason? What else can we say about reason beside it being related to the common good? So this is a passage from page 13. Quote, "In my reconstruction, the idea of reason comprises three elements: impartiality with regards to persons, temporal impartiality, and rational or well-founded beliefs. No doubt we should add goodwill in order to exclude impartial malice." End quote. So we have here impartiality with regard to persons. So I am as important as you, as important as another person, a third person. This is what people refer to when they talk about the veil of ignorance. Temporal impartiality is the idea that today is as important as 2 weeks from today or a year from today. We should make decisions that protect well-being and our interests in all those points in time, assuming that we will be alive and our conditions are generally the same. So lack of temporal impartiality means that I want my needs to be satisfied today, and I don't care about the future. So he talks about how both rational self-interest and rational action, in the sense of compliance with reason, that pursues the common good, could both be interrupted by passions. So that's one commonality between rational self-interest and rational action that pursues the common good. When we say that someone is overcome by passion, what do we mean? In general, what we mean is that they are driven by one of their desires without having regard or without having taking into account their other desires, the totality of their desires or the totality of themselves as a person. That's what we generally mean when we say somebody is interrupted by their passion. So when somebody is overcome by passion, there is a kind of incoherence between their desires. But there is also the possibility of incoherence with respect to one single desire. So let's read an example about this. This is from pages 18 and 19. Quote, "A desire may exhibit pragmatic incoherence in the sense that the means of realizing the desired state prevent it from being realized." Like what? We could analyze, for example, a fruitless attempt to overcome by a mere effort of the will insomnia, sexual impotence, or stuttering. These are cases where the more you put your will into overcoming the problem, you might end up with intensifying the problem. This does not exclude the possibility of realizing the desired state in an indirect way. To remain within the Sartrean tradition, he had referred to Sartre before, we could also mention paradoxical injunctions such as be spontaneous. So we could take this as I want to add a footnote here. We could take this as a way of criticizing Javier Rivera's dating method that he wants to introduce. He encourages people to be spontaneous on first dates, for example. With this point here, Elster is telling us that sometimes that kind of injunction doesn't work because you kind of defeat the purpose by trying to be. It's like most of us, I think, have experienced either directly or indirectly somebody else trying to be spontaneous, trying to be creative, trying to be whatever, cool or honest, and not really being sure how to enact that, how to execute that, because we don't know what it means for us necessarily to be spontaneous. There are also examples from religion. The religious sentiments, usually in relation to heaven, going to heaven, they usually have this attitude that going to heaven shouldn't be your main goal. It shouldn't be your only goal. That's not why you do good deeds. There's something wrong if your only motivation is going to heaven, even if everything you do is right. So that's another example of achieving a desired state, but it would be more effective or more appropriate to try to achieve that desired state indirectly, not directly. Let me touch on one other facet of reason, and this is well-founded beliefs. It takes effort to form well-founded beliefs, well-founded rational beliefs, and a decision should go into how much time we want to invest forming such well-founded beliefs. Let's read again from the text. This is from page 27. A general, an army general, must not attack before he has surveyed the terrain, or a surgeon operate before he has examined the patient. However, they must not delay too long, for then they may be surprised by the enemy's attack or flight, or by the patient's death. Thus, there exists in principle an optimal investment that depends on the agent's preferences, as well as on his beliefs regarding the expected costs and benefits. And here he introduces the idea of hyper-rationality. Let's go back to the text. Quote, there are cases in which the search for the optimal action is not worth the trouble, and in which the rational actor would adopt a different procedure, such as following tradition or deciding to flip a coin. We can in fact define hyper-rationality as the search for the action that would have been optimal if one ignored the cost of the search itself. On pages 66 and 67, we get a really good example of hyper-rationality, and I thought this is definitely worth including in my discussion of the book. Let's read this together. It's a bit longer than the other passages, but it's very good. In most Western countries, the law says that in case of disagreement between the parents, custody must be determined by the best interest of the child. That is, custody should be assigned to the parent best suited to promote the child's well-being. However, experience abundantly shows that juridico-psychological determination of the relative suitability of the parents is a process that is highly painful and harmful for the very child whose interests it supposes to protect. The child's interests would probably be better respected by the tradition assumption in favor of the mother, or even, why not, by drawing lots. End quote. He goes on to say that, again, quote, modern Western societies are imbued with hyper-rationality. It is in this sense, and in this sense only, that one may speak of rationality, or rather its abuse, as a specifically Western or modern phenomenon. End quote. So this is the only way in which it is accepted to be so-called anti-intellectual or against rationality. But we are doing that if we are doing it right, if we are taking a justifiable stance against a rational approach. It is only because it is hyper-rational disregarding some other important factor. Okay, something else that I found interesting in the treatment of reason, in human beings' treatment of reason, is that the possibility of objectifying reason or objectifying a principle, instrumentalizing it or weaponizing it, if you will. This is a case of a manipulation, a possible manipulation of our principles. Let's read from the text. This is from page 63 and 64. Quote, "The norm of impartiality also has a strategic use whose effect is more ambiguous. Even in contexts where interested motivations are permitted, as in wage bargaining, the parties often appeal to the principles of equity or equality. Since giving up a principle constitutes a greater concession than giving up an interest, and thus calls for a greater counter-concession, it is to the advantage of all parties to present themselves as not being moved by self-interest alone." So they should say, this is not just my interest, it is the principle. And once they do that, then they have a bigger bargaining chip to ask for a greater counter-concession. If this behavior is generalized, agreement may prove impossible. The appeal to reason subverts reason. All right, and I also couldn't resist including the final passage from the book, which is beautiful, uses a beautiful metaphor. Let's read it. Quote, "What finally are the functions of reason and rationality in human behaviors? They are the functions, respectively, of the prince's tutor and his counselor. The tutor teaches the prince to promote the public good in the long term." So the public good, the impartiality with respect to persons in the long term, temporal impartiality. The tutor teaches the prince to promote the public good in the long term. The counselor tells him how to act in order to achieve his goals, whatever they might be, in the most efficient way. It is not incumbent upon the counselor to impose the demands of reason, but if the tutor has done his job well, the prince will make them his own. End quote. All right, let me add with two recommendations. If you'd like to read a relatively easy book about human reasoning, rationality, critical thinking, I would recommend The Scout Mindset by Julia Galef. If you like a greater challenge, a bigger challenge, a more difficult text, more difficult but also more rewarding, I would recommend The Conflict of Mind by O.G. Rose. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll speak with you next time.